Hey, Pair fans. This episode is brought to you by Audible.com. If you like listening to beautiful voices like ours instead of reading words, then head on over to Audible, where you get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/paratruth, where you can choose from over 180,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Christian and non-Christian paranormal investigators. They have two different views, and it seems as if neither of them can ever agree on anything. So what happens when a mainstream view of the paranormal crosses paths with the Christian view? Something epic. This is Paratruth Radio.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P to the T to the R Paratruth Radio. We are the newest age in paranormal research and your one-stop spot for the latest paranormal info. If you are just joining us for the first time ever, welcome. Glad to have you. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And before we get started with the show, we want to let you and everybody else out there know that while you're listening to the show tonight, check out our website at paratruthradio.com, where you can learn more about us and what we do. Also, feel free to look into our Patreon account at paratruthradio.com and help us to continue bringing the world fresh, entertaining media each and every week.
And by contributing, you'll become an executive producer of an upcoming episode of Paratruth Radio and officially become a part of the Paratruth family, which will include special monthly behind-the-scenes access to our productions.
Folks, welcome. We're glad to have you back. For those of you just joining us, welcome for the first time. I hope you guys enjoy the show. If you have any questions for us, feel free to hit us up at paratruthradio.com or paratruth@gmail.com. And of course, check out any of our social media links. You'll find them at our website or right here, wherever it is you're listening. So today we have a topic that we've been wanting to discuss for quite a while. And it's something that I think we both touched on in the past, maybe not together, but at least on separate shows, maybe. I know I have. And it's one that has really influenced the course of American history. A lot of people don't think about it, but the truth is that the Salem witch trials happen to have a pretty negative effect on America. And
well, I would say even it's shaped Christian history and a negative effect on Christianity in general, too. Sure.
And what's interesting, though, is if this didn't happen, if the Salem witch trials didn't take place in 1692, where would our country be today? That's the main question. That's the big question. Of course, we can't say because we don't know. That goes back into all of our history-changing stuff that we're talking about over the last couple of weeks. But we're going to go ahead and jump right into the show. But first, to our transition intro.
Now Paratruth presents Salem, the birth of American communism.
All right, folks, so those Salem witch trials, one of the most horrific incidents in American history. Interestingly enough, the Salem witch trials occurred in Massachusetts, colonial Massachusetts, between 1692 and 1693. There were around 200 people that were accused of practicing witchcraft, the so-called devil's magic, and 20 of which were executed. Now, what's interesting about this is even though there were some apologies later on after the trials were over, an official apology of the entire trial didn't come into fruition until 1950, which is pretty messed up.
Almost 300 years. Yeah, that's exactly. More than a little messed up.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a background here on the Salem witch trials, and then we'll jump into some interesting discussion here. So first and foremost, colonial Massachusetts, 1692 and 1693. This whole thing took place in about a year, and it began with two little girls. Darn girls, man. Always the kids. It's always the kids.
That's the sad part about this is it started with two little girls and then just went.
It did. It really did. And it started in January of 1962. Reverend Paris's daughter, Elizabeth, age 9, and niece, Abigail Williams, age 11, started having fits. These fits consisted of screaming, throwing things, uttering peculiar sounds, and even contorted their bodies into strange positions. Now, when the Reverend couldn't figure out what was going on, he ended up calling in a doctor. And the doctor went and blamed the supernatural, saying that these two little girls were bewitched. Now, the question here is, who really set everything into motion? Was it these two little girls, or was it the doctor? I don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have that type of information and no real theories. However, most people blame it on these two little girls, because later on, there was another girl named Ann Putnam, age 11, also began to experience similar episodes. And on February 29th, under the pressure of magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne, the girls blamed 3 women for afflicting them. These women were Tituba, the Paris's Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman. What do you think's going on here, Justin? These 3 kids start throwing fits, and within a month they start pointing fingers. Why do you think that?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, like, to hear that a doctor went to the supernatural when today it's the exact opposite now is kind of interesting. Why they were pointing fingers, my guess would be is so that they didn't befall the fate of what these other women did. But what constitutes a fit here? Were they really having like a mental disorder, or were they having some type of epileptic seizures? What was going on there? Were they just trying to get attention? And, that's what happened. Because if it was just them trying to get attention, then they would divert blame to somebody else for even more attention. Oh, these poor girls, they've been cursed by these 3 witches, and that's what's going on. If it was just, they were sick, and the doctor says, oh, then they're being afflicted supernaturally, these girls would play into that because they don't know any better, and they're like, right, these women are the ones that are doing that. And what better set of people than, back in those days, the most obvious, which would have been a slave, a beggar, and an elderly woman. 3 people that would have been easy to pick on. I mean, especially nowadays, people still treat the homeless as below them, and elderly, impoverished, which would mean she's poor, just not homeless. And slavery now today is abolished except for in third world countries. So to blame them because they're looking for a scapegoat, and they can see that these people, these magistrates, are looking for a scapegoat, go to people that maybe are below them in status, because most white people back then were higher than these people that were named.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it was little girls that ended up blaming these 3 women. And so it's like, what is it that the girls, that these 3 young girls at age 9 and 2 at 11, what is it that they can actually gain from, pointing their fingers at these women? And can there have been something that these women had done to them, or were they just simply looking for attention? Right.
It could have been scapegoat things. It also could have been Reverend Paris saying, you need to name these people because we need to get you out of the limelight of this.
Well, it's interesting because it really began with these 3 women as being the guilty party, if you will. But interestingly enough, both Osborne and Good claimed their innocence. However, Tituba, on the other hand, ended up confessing, claiming that she was a witch. She stated that the devil came to me and bid me to serve him. She describes elaborate images of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a black man who wanted her to sign his book. Now, she admitted to signing the book and said that there were several other witches along with her who were looking to destroy the Puritans. Now, of course, despite the fact that both Osborne and Good ended up claiming their innocence, all three women were put in jail. Now, the curious thing is, why would Tituba have gone and confessed to being a witch? And I think there's a couple of different views out there, and one that's probably the most popular is she thought if she were to confess and say, hey, I have the names of other people, maybe they'd give her kind of a, little relief, let her go and not charge her as harshly if she were to give up the other names. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, as it ended up creating a great controversy among the colonial Massachusetts, and ended up charging 200 people. That's a lot of people, in a matter of a year.
What I found fascinating about this was it was men, women, and then even dogs that were actually hung, of the 20 that were hung.
Right. Absolutely. It's quite interesting. Now, despite these three women being the first accused, neither of the three were the first to be put to death.
Yep.
Which is, again, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So despite these women being placed in prison, it wasn't until May 27th of 1692 that the first case was actually brought to court. And that case was the case of Bridget Bishop, probably the most famous person in this particular event. And that's simply because despite being an older woman and, all of that, she was the first one to be put to death. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, she was an older woman who happened to have very gossipy habits and promiscuity. So surely enough, she's kind of on the, on that checklist of the type of people we don't want around, right?
Right.
So that would make sense why they would accuse her. It just doesn't make sense as to why she would have been hung for her crimes. Or so-called crimes, because she's not being condemned for her promiscuity or for her gossiping, but for being a witch. However, much of the court at the time was paying attention to evidence that didn't really support any facts of these women being witches. Instead, they were listening to little girls saying, "Oh, I had these visions." And they're saying, okay, they're taking those into account. Okay, these girls had visions, therefore they are witches. It's like you can't use that as support, But nonetheless, Bishop ended up being found guilty on June 10th and became the first person hanged on what was later called Gallows Hill, which we'll get into a little bit later. And of course, it just started to go out from there because people... it seemed at the beginning that everyone was choosing or pointing fingers at the people who were less fortunate or who weren't quite saints, if you will, as being the witches.
Right.
However, eventually it did get to a woman by the name of Martha Corey, who was a loyal member of the church at Salem Village, which was even a greater concern to the community because if, of course, Martha Corey, who's a loyal member of the church, is a witch, then obviously anyone can be a witch. And everything just got blown out of proportion from that moment on. So with this happening, with Bishop being found guilty and hung for her crime, about 5 days later after the event, a respected minister by the name of Cotton Mather ended up writing a letter imploring the court who condemned her not to allow spectral evidence, as I was just saying, of any testimony about dreams or visions, as it just simply could not hold up and should not hold up in court. But of course, largely the court ended up ignoring such a letter and ended up continuing to kill people for their crime as witches. They ended up sentencing 5 people who were hanged in July, 5 more in August, and 8 more in September of 1692. And on October 3rd, following his son's footsteps, Increase Mather, then president of Harvard, denounced the use of spectral evidence. For he said it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. And from that moment on, they were able to bring in a new court system, get rid of all the spectral evidence, and eventually, Governor Phipps, who, in response to Mather's plea, ended up pardoning the rest of the people who were held in prison on their witchcraft conspiracy charges. In the end, 20 people were killed, 19 hung, one, I believe, was pressed to death, but with stones, which, by the way, took several days to kill him, and 2 dogs.
The one thing that I found interesting about this is they threw out spectral evidence, definition being dreams and visions, but didn't throw out, I watched this person turn from a dog to a human, when really the dog probably walked away and then the person walked back and they're like, hey, they turned in or didn't turn into people.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird thing, but I said, but I don't know, I guess in this case it's different because we're talking about there were other people who ended up coming forth other than the little girls, older people who claim to have seen, winged monsters flying through the sky, and hearing noises in the woods and seeing these dogs. So now they're taking into account not something that these little girls claim to have had in their head, but actual visual witnesses or witnesses who claim to have visually seen some of these creatures. Some said that they were goblins in their church offices and things like that, right, or in their homes. So there's all kinds of things happening at the time. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and we're going to get into more of this in a little while here. Gallows Hill. Well, we're going to talk about that. That's something I think is important because many people believe that Gallows Hill was where these witches were hung. However, recent evidence claims that it wasn't Gallows Hill, but instead was somewhere else. We're also going to go ahead and get into 5 myths about those Salem witch trials and discern whether or not those myths are true or if they're just simply myths, and just what exactly it is that these Salem witch trials meant for America.
All right, folks, after Eric's random fact of the day, we're going to get all into that and more.
Now, Eric's random fact of the day.
Millions of people all around the world enjoy soda pop on a daily basis. One of the most famous sodas is a citrus soda known as 7-Up, which was created in 1929. But I'll bet that most people don't know what 7-Up stands for. It turns out that the number 7 was selected because the original containers that 7-Up was produced in were 7 ounces, and the word up indicated the direction of the bubbles.
This was Eric's random fact of the day.
All right, folks, welcome back to Paratruth Radio. My name is Justin.
And I'm Eric.
And we've been discussing the Salem witch trials. And just before break, Eric mentioned that we're going to get into some interesting facts about the Salem witch trials, starting off with where these witches were really hung. So, Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So, according to a video on the Washington Post, historians from Gallows Hill Project pinpointed the spot of the Salem witch hangings, which actually turns out they believe to be Proctor's Ledge. Now, researchers examined eyewitness accounts in their investigation, and one account mentioned a house below a hill where the executions took place, and others spoke of viewing these executions from their windows. Now, the researchers determined the location of Proctor's Ledge using aerial photography and advanced mapping technology, which helped them rule out the myth that the hangings occurred at the nearby Gallows Hill, which was invisible from the houses that they identified. So because of this, Salem city officials now plan to preserve the area and install a memorial marker. Now, what's interesting here is that if I'm not mistaken, Gallows Hill was something that was coined back around colonial times. And so it's hard to believe that Gallows Hill would have been, I guess, misidentified at such an early time. I understand 300 years later we might misidentify it, but I think people back then would have said, oh, that's Gallows Hill because they watched the things happen. The only thing I could think about is if modern city officials ended up switching the two names around and hence calling Gallows Hill Proctor's Ledge and what should have been Proctor's Ledge Gallows Hill. But I think it's interesting because current day Gallows Hill supposedly cannot be seen from where the homes used to stand back in Salem, colonial Salem. And so it's interesting to think, like in this case, there's this video, and it's kind of weird to see because you see the video, and I almost want to be there in a creepy way because, like, this is where 19 people were killed for being witches, and it's this eerie feeling, like, oh, can you imagine being those people down in the homes watching it, or just being, these witches who are here, or these women? I don't want to say witches because they weren't witches, but these women who were falsely accused of witchcraft being hung here, and what they would have seen as the stool moved from underneath them.
Well, things like that, I mean, it could have been lost in history because, I mean, back then there were great fires, there were things that would have messed up historical facts because it would have burned the actual written documents saying where things were. So it's possible that might have happened. But if you're looking at eyewitness accounts, you would think, how can you mess something up that easily if all of these accounts have been written down somewhere and preserved?
Right.
So it's hard to say what really happened as far as why things were named. Why things were named what they were named. Because stuff like that keeps popping up throughout recent times about a lot of ancient history.
Right.
I mean, just look at some of the facts that are popping up about the Bible now that we thought were just nothing more than myth and legend in a holy book. So, interesting stuff, though. So some of the other, what are some of the other myths that you came across that are kind of debunked now?
Yeah, so, I mean, there were about 5 total myths here regarding the Salem witch trials, which I think a lot of people just misunderstand. The very first myth is that the convicted witnesses were burned at the stake. I think this is a common one that people constantly think, if a witch is going to be executed for the witchcraft, they're likely being burned. But that didn't happen in Salem. In fact, according again to the Washington Post, it was usually the French witches, those in France, who were burned, while English witches were hung. Hence the reason those of Salem, Massachusetts were all hung. And so I think that's just something that, we see in movies, we see in books of these people being burned, but that was something that happened overseas most often. So that's myth number 1.
Well, one thing I like about this myth in the Washington Post is that there was a conundrum at Channel Island of Guernsey when 3 witches turned up in 1617. The people hung them, then burned them. They're like, screw this. We're not taking any chances here. You're getting both. I don't care how you're supposed to be done. You're getting both.
Well, and some people believed that a witch would be able to come back from the dead if they weren't properly, taken care of or disposed of. Same thing with vampires. There's so many myths surrounding vampires. Sometimes you take the heart out. Sometimes you put the head of the so-called vampire at the feet in the coffin. Sometimes you stake them down put roses around the coffin, things like that.
One they found where there were bricks shoved into the mouth of people.
Yeah. So that there's all these superstitions and mythologies as to how you would keep some of these supernatural creatures at bay. So yeah, naturally, you know, if you're concerned, hanging and then burning might be one step. Let's hope it doesn't happen anymore. Myth number 2. All the victims were women. Now, this is something we've already discussed a little bit, but plain and simple, the answer is no. Not all the victims were women. There was 4 men.
Not all of them were human either.
That is also true, but we don't hear about that. That's not as popular. But of the 19 people who were hanged in Salem, 4 were men. One of which, whose name was Feckless, a fortune-telling carpenter, and a 42-year-old Harvard-educated minister. These really at this time, everybody, it was free game. Women, men, et cetera, but often with the men, they were known as wizards instead of witches.
Or warlocks. Yeah.
Or warlocks. And they were typically seen as more powerful than the women, back in those days. So needless to say, that myth very obviously debunked. You could see that pretty much anywhere if you just look online, or you can actually go to Salem and go to the museum and see some of the stuff they have, and you can read the papers yourself. All right. Myth number 3, the idea that panic took. When one person found out that there might have been a witch in Salem, hysteria just went, and everybody started going crazy. Well, this is one where it's kind of on the edge. I think there was a certain amount of panic, but at the same time, this is more of a thing that was condensed into just the Salem town. Right. Now, it did become widespread, hence the 200 people. But many of the names that were named, in fact, one of the Salem girls named a total of 62 people. But the ones that she named claimed that they had no clue who this person was. They were from other towns, did not know of their existence. And so naturally, they're like, well, this can't really be. I'm not worried about it, so on and so forth. But what's interesting about this is, how did this girl name 62 people who she didn't know, and yet these people claim they had never met her? That's something that's a little more supernatural and incredibly interesting.
Almost makes it sound like these girls were the ones behind being witches themselves and diverting attention elsewhere.
Absolutely. So Salem remained the epicenter of the crisis, but Andover, Massachusetts, about 15 miles away, was actually most severely affected, as nearly 1 in every 10 of its residents were accused of witchcraft, often by their own family members, many of whom themselves confessed to having signed satanic pacts and flown over the treetops. Interesting. Yeah, just interesting. Oh, goodness. Myth number 4. Superstition was the driving force. Many people believe that it was just senseless superstition that caused people to go crazy and freak out over witches. Nowadays we see someone throwing fits. We don't think, oh, a witch is bewitching them. We think, okay, they have a mental disability, or there's something wrong, like they're just acting out or
some
something
type
like
of
that,
disease, right? Yeah.
So they're saying here that superstition in this case wasn't really the driving force, but this is one of those that are also kind of on the edge. Now, again, it affected Christianity because at the time, many of the Salem superstitions, such as the ideas about witches, came straight out of the Bible, the Old Testament in particular. Now, those who knew their Bible best believed most fervently in witchcraft, but not coincidentally, it tended to turn up in more pious homes. So in this case, I think when it comes to superstition, it's things that people just don't really know or understand. That's what a superstition is, These people who claim to, these people who hunted the witches or claimed such and such a person was a witch, they were pretty well educated and literate. So they were able to read. They were able to understand everything they were doing and what was legit and what wasn't. But yet they still ended up going and poisoning the current community and the culture because of what they read.
Right. I mean, one of the biggest things to remember in this particular debunked myth is even though superstition wasn't a driving force, it still played a factor because people eventually started believing these superstitions. Because at that time they might not have, but then once all of this started going about, it's like, wait a minute, I was told about this. This is what's going on. So yeah, I think that is actually a really good debunked myth because a lot of people do believe it was just superstition and to an extent, yes, that played a factor, but that wasn't the original driving force behind this.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the real driving force here was simply, interestingly, religion at the time.
Yeah. And people being possibly sick or whatever.
Yeah. And that's still the case today, both for Christians and non-Christians alike, or not alike, depending on how you want to look at it. People always, come on, there's plenty of Christians that you and I know, who are quick to cut everyone's throat and stab them in the back because they have
figuratively, of course, this era. Back then, we literally would have been slit.
And so, but they're quick. They're superstitious. They think anything and everything is the devil. It is just crazy. It's like, all right, look, there's a difference between a religion and a relationship with God. And you need to step away from the religion and walk into that relationship with the Lord because you guys are all really screwed up. Sorry for those of you who are listening and actually do what I just said. But we only speak the truth here, guys. So get off your high horses. Anyway, myth number 5, the final myth that I have for you. Ergot poisoning was to blame for the witch trials. This is one that actually you come across quite often in your research that may have, played some kind of cue into why the girls were acting the way they did. Behavioral scientist Linda Caporeal proposed a elegant theory in 1976 that a contaminated rye supply introduced ergot poisoning to Salem, causing convulsions and hallucinations in the accusing girls. And it's interesting because these girls, because they were acting out and convulsing and, doing this and doing that, it would make sense that this ergot poisoning could be to blame. However, evidence supports the fact that these girls were eating the same meals that everybody else was eating. So why would it be that they were affected and the others weren't? This particular myth has been debunked, then revived and debunked again, and seems to continually go around in circles regarding the Salem witch trials. But nonetheless, people believe that some of the things that these girls were doing and seeing just simply wouldn't be the cause of ergot poisoning. For example, some of these girls were falling into trances, and they were seeing fellow parishioners perching in the church beams. Things like that isn't necessarily something that you would get from ergot poisoning, but some of the physical symptoms, yeah. So nobody really knows what this could have been. I don't think it was ergot poisoning, though.
Well, when you think of poisoning, though, you think of people's health deteriorating, death. That didn't happen to these girls.
Right. It didn't. It didn't happen at all. And again, there are other people who are seeing things. Plenty of grown adults who are seeing winged beasts in the fields and goblins in their parlors saw these things, but they didn't have any convulsions. So obviously, if everyone were poisoned, there'd be a similar thing happening, and most likely, for all we know, Salem would have been the next Croatoan. So, but anyway, that is our 5 myths, debunked or otherwise. You decide. But I thought those were pretty interesting. I wanted to just throw those out there because I think those are some very common myths, myths that even I believed, some of them, such as the idea of, burning witches at the stake instead of hanging them,
Not that either or didn't happen. They've both happened. It's just in Salem, it was the hanging.
Right.
And it's funny that it brought that up because the one show that my wife and I watch is American Horror Story, and one of them was called Covenant, which was about Salem witches. And the way that they punish each other for harming other witches is burning them at the stake. So you would think Salem, they would have got their history correct, but interesting though.
Yeah.
It was actually a myth or a notion that I had that all witches were burned at the stake. They weren't hung. And I don't remember ever thinking that about the Salem trials. I just thought in general. So it's interesting to see that that actually is a myth, that there are two separate cultures that do it differently. And then one particular civilization that did it both.
Right, both.
Or settlement, I guess, and not civilization. So, yeah. So what are your final thoughts on this? Because, for me, yes, religion, superstition had a factor in this. Unfortunately, it brought down a huge dark shadow on Christianity, just kind of like the Crusades. A lot of people talk about the Crusades and how horrible, and the Crusades were horrible. And that has also brought a dark shadow on Christianity. But I think that there were a lot of things in factor here. I can't say that superstition or religion did not have a say, because it obviously did. But to what extent did it actually cause people to start killing these girls? Because I honestly think there were more political things going on as well, pressures from political things going on that caused them to actually start killing these people. And
there were, there was there were wars happening overseas. There were, people were afraid of the Native Americans here in America, that they were going to just show up with their tribe and slaughter the villages, things like that. So there's a lot of, factors that play into this. And hence the title of our show, the birth of American communism. That's pretty much what we see here. This is the idea of communism taking place. And it's actually a pretty creepy thing and scary thing, because that's happening today still. In regards to, my thoughts about the dark history of Christianity, look, there's dark history in every religion. There's always those whack jobs who take things too far, who like, for example, when you think of, some people will look at the Old Testament. I've had this argument with people. They'll look at the Old Testament and say that the God of the Old Testament is a different God from the New Testament, because the Old Testament God is, striking people down for being witches or for their sins and stuff like that. In the New Testament, he's not. And they don't understand the true transition. They don't understand what's going on, or the context or anything like that, because they don't care to read the Bible. They just want to, get the gist, look at it from the outside instead of stepping into the box, if you will. And so there's all these people who are going to do things in the name of God that God just simply wouldn't really do. We see the same thing in the Muslim community right now happening overseas. There are many Christians being killed, beheaded, raped, etc., in the name of Allah. And even though there are some Muslims out there, and quite a few probably, who are innocent in the matter, and who are gentle. It's those that take things way out of context and proportion who are creating the bad image for the rest of the religion. And so there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. And I think the same thing has just happened here with Christianity. And we still see people like that today. Now, I haven't seen anything in the news at any time in my life of Christians killing somebody for this or that. But that doesn't mean that they're not persecuting other people, other individuals, because of what they believe, and that's the main thing about the Christian faith is you can't persecute people. You can't go and, I'm not going to look, I won't agree with the Muslims' view on faith and on who God is, but I'm not going to go and condemn them. That's not my job. That's a job for God to do after our time here on earth is done. So, you really got to show respect to everybody regardless. And if anyone doesn't respect you, Jesus says it plainly. Kick the dust off your shoes and walk away. Let them go about their business and God will take care of that. So yeah, crap happens.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the Muslim thing and what's going on in the Middle East right now, because there are extremists in any religion, like you said, and there are a lot of Muslim people that say that the Quran does not say to kill the Westerners are to be killed. A lot of people say, now granted, I've never read the Quran, I don't know for sure, but a lot of Muslims are saying that a lot of these people doing the killing are extremists. That is not how the Muslim faith should go. Yes, Muhammad was a warrior prophet in the Quran, but that is not the true part of their faith. So I'm seeing a lot of that same stuff, like you're saying, in modern day as it was back then too. And it's hard to think that people can do these atrocities to one another and just not blink an eye.
Yeah, it's crazy, and if again, this is one of those subjects that are just touchy,
Well, I think that's why not a whole lot of people talk about it.
Right. And so even right now, I'm just going to leave it at just what you said, because I don't need to be getting into all of that right now tonight, regarding the difference between religions. That'll be an upcoming episode, something Justin and I have already talked about. And we'll talk about that, and that'll be a topic that's more along the lines, at least on my side, because I know Justin will argue with me on some of my points, probably many of my points, as to why religions cannot coexist. So that's something to look forward to in the future. We'll be doing that. But, I think in the end, this is very interesting historical event, very, a graphic, horrible, sad end to things, and just the way things ended up. But you have to question, same question we asked earlier. What is it about the Salem witch trials that made America the way it is? Would America be different if Salem hadn't happened? We don't know. We simply don't know. Communism exists, period. Yeah. And there's a good chance that it would have showed up, rearing its ugly face, one way or the other. But I'll tell you one thing, is that I think of many of the things that we talk about, there's a learning experience, but I think in cases that are historically accurate and historically solid, such as this is truth, this really happened, there's things to be learned from it. And it's, don't judge a book by its cover. Make sure you look at all facets of evidence before coming to a conclusion. And plain and simple, don't be ignorant. You take those three things into consideration, you'll be okay. You'll make it through life without a problem. And you won't be starting, as much strife as we've seen throughout the rest of history, the way wars are begun and things like that, Talk it out. Talk it out, people. Figure out what's really going on before you jump to any conclusions that are unnecessary.
My one final thought on this before we wrap it up is, you mentioned, would it have been different if the Salem witch trials had not happened? It's in my personal opinion that history constantly repeats itself. So if something wouldn't have happened in Salem, it would have happened somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. All right, folks. We're going to come up to the end here. We're going to be right back after Justin's paranormal headlines. Don't go anywhere. We'll finish out the show.
And now, Paratruth Radio's paranormal headlines.
What's going on, Paratruthers? Justin here with your paranormal headlines, and these headlines are from unexplainedmysteries.com. China and Europe plan to build Moon Village. ESA has confirmed rumors that the two space agencies are planning an ambitious lunar collaboration. First hinted at by the Secretary General for China's space agency Tian Yulong, the international endeavor, about which little is currently known, could see a manned outpost being built on the surface of the moon with a particular focus on space tourism and lunar mining. The Chinese have a very ambitious moon program already in place, said spokesman Pal Vistendal. Space has changed since the space race of the 60s. We recognize that to explore space for peaceful purposes, we do international cooperation. ESA Director General Johann Dietrich Werner has described the proposed base as a moon village and believes that it could also serve as a launch site for future missions to Mars. Exactly when such a project might get off the ground, however, remains unclear. And this has been Justin with your paranormal headlines.
This was a segment of Paratruth Radio's paranormal headlines.
All right, guys, welcome back to Paratruth Radio. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And we are at the end of our show, Salem, the birth of American communism. We hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions for us, feel free to hit us up. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, on our website, paratruthradio.com. And, of course, via email, paratruthradio@gmail.com. If you missed any of that, stay tuned. We'll play it again at the end. Justin, what is going on next week?
All right, next week we are bringing back again Nick Redfern to talk about another recent book of his, Secret Societies, The Complete Guide to Histories, Rites, and Rituals. So it's going to be an awesome one. I think we had him on for something similar, Secret Histories, a while back, but this one will be getting into the nitty-gritty of the Masons, I'm sure the Illuminati, Knights Templar, a bunch of different ones. One thing I wanted to put out there really quick to you guys is make sure you're checking out FringeRadioNetwork.com and RadioandPodcast.com. And if you aren't contributing to the Patreon account, that's fine. We appreciate you listening either way. But one way you can support us is like, share, subscribe. Make sure you're reviewing us wherever we're at. That helps us greatly. So definitely share us with any friends and family that are interested in these topics. I think that's the best way you can support us. If you feel the urge to donate to the Patreon account, we so do appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, folks, that was your episode. We were glad to talk with you guys. Again, if you have any questions, hit us up. You'll find out where at the end of the show here, so stay tuned just a little bit longer. But until next week, you'll find us right here, same time, same place. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
Peace.
If you enjoyed this episode of Paratruth Radio and you would like to listen to it again, or are interested in listening to any of our past episodes, then you can find them at Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and the Fringe Radio Network.
Or for a one-time fix of all of your Paratruth needs, simply drop in to paratruthradio.com.
And of course, like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for brand new updates on our show every day.
Finally, we love bringing you fresh, entertaining media each and every week, but we can't do it without you. So please check out our Patreon account. Simply go to paratruthradio.com, click on the Patreon logo, and help us to continue bringing you the latest and greatest in paranormal research.